The year was 2020, a year of uncertainty, fear, and panic, a year when neighbors turned into strangers and strangers into
You
threats.
can't do
It
this
was
to
the
me!
time when
I
shelves were
haven't done
stripped
anything
bare,
wrong!
when the world learned how fragile its systems truly were. But for one man, a 29-year-old homeowner, the storm brewing outside his door was nothing compared to the one already lurking within his neighborhood. He had bought the house in late 2019, a modest but comfortable place nestled in a quiet suburban community. It had belonged to his uncle before him, a man wise enough to understand the politics of this place and brave enough to stay independent of the homeowners association. His uncle had warned him before signing the papers. "You'll have peace, but not if she gets her way." She, of course, was the HOA president, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards. She was older, proud, and radiated the kind of authority only those with too much free time and too little power could crave. The deal was too good to refuse. The house came at half its value, a gift wrapped in a quiet warning. He accepted, fully aware that freedom sometimes came with a target on your back. When he first moved in, the neighborhood seemed calm. The lawns were pristine, the driveways polished, the mailboxes identical. But there was something almost eerie about it, as if every smile carried a question behind it and every glance measured whether he fit in. That illusion of normalcy shattered within days when the doorbell rang, and standing there was the infamous woman herself. Her presence was almost theatrical. Short graying hair, thick makeup hiding deep wrinkles, a plastic smile stretched too wide, and in her hand, a welcome basket. But the basket was just bait. Behind that facade was a predator looking for compliance. She spoke in the honeyed tone of control, offering forms, membership papers, and a pitch about community harmony. But he already knew her game. His uncle had warned him that every new homeowner outside her grasp became her next conquest. He declined politely but firmly. Her smile cracked instantly. The pleasantries vanished. She insisted membership was mandatory. He countered with the truth that it was. The mask came off then and the real Karen emerged, the neighborhood tyrant whose crown rested on fear and gossip. She left that day with venom in her eyes and a promise or a threat that she'd be back. Weeks passed and her tactics began subtly. Letters left in his mailbox, notices about grass length and driveway maintenance. Anonymous complaints from neighbors who suddenly found fault in everything he did. But he stayed calm. He'd expected this. After all, she could only control those who let her. He wasn't one of them. Then came 2020's chaos. News broke of shortages. People began hoarding supplies, toilet paper, sanitizer, disinfectant, anything that offered the illusion of safety. He acted early, ordering in bulk, stocking up responsibly, knowing how bad things could get. Pallets of toilet paper arrived, cases of sanitizer stacked neatly in his garage. His security cameras recorded it all, packages signed for, safely stored away. But in a world ruled by fear, preparation looked like greed. Neighbors watched. Whispers started. Soon, the entire street buzzed with envy and resentment. The man who refused to join their HOA now looked like the man with everything they didn't have. When shelves went empty and panic spread, knocks began at his door. Desperate faces, familiar ones, neighbors who once sneered at him now begging for toilet paper, sanitizer, gloves. He refused politely, keeping his supplies for friends and family. But the more he said no, the angrier they grew. The same people who had shunned him now called him selfish. He became the neighborhood villain overnight. And then, as if sensing blood in the water, Karen returned. She arrived in full force, standing at his door like an executioner dressed in authority. Spoke of community responsibility, of sharing during hard times. But it wasn't a request, it was a demand. The HOA president had decided that his private property was now a shared resource. He denied her again. This time she didn't leave quietly. Her shrill voice echoed across the neighborhood, promising that he'd regret this. The following weeks grew tense. Strange things began happening. Trash dumped on his lawn, nails scattered on his driveway, anonymous letters slipped under his door. The air felt charged, hostile, as if an invisible line had been crossed. Then came the day that would change everything. It was a normal workday, quiet and uneventful until his phone buzzed. His home security system was alerting him, motion detected. Then again, and again. He opened the live feed and froze. There was someone breaking into his home. The figure was dressed in black, face hidden behind a white hockey mask. A gloved hand pried open the back door with a crowbar. The intruder moved with purpose, rushing to the shelves where his supplies were kept, grabbing, tossing, throwing them out through the back window. Outside, two small figures, children, were gathering them into bags. It was chaos. He called the police instantly and drove home like a man possessed. When he arrived, the flashing red and blue lights painted his house in tragedy. Officers were already leading someone away in handcuffs, a familiar figure whose pride had finally snapped. It was Karen, the HOA president, the self-declared enforcer of order, caught in the act of burglary and using her own children to do it. The backyard was a mess of toilet paper scattered like confetti, sanitizer bottles rolling in the grass. The irony was bitter. In her crusade to set a good example, she had become a criminal. He pressed charges without hesitation. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen, the woman who once ruled the HOA with an iron fist, was paraded out in handcuffs in front of her own subjects. Her empire crumbled overnight. Her husband, quiet, tired, and long-suffering, came to apologize. He admitted he had been planning to divorce her for months. The theft was just the final straw. Child Protective Services got involved. Custody was taken from her. The mask she wore for years had finally been ripped away. Months later, he replaced the broken door with Karen's ex-husband's help. The neighborhood felt different, quieter, humbled. The new HOA president kept his distance, and peace finally returned. But karma has a long memory. More than a year later, during a trip to another city, he saw her again, dressed in a supermarket uniform, bagging groceries. The woman who once demanded obedience now reduced to anonymity. Their eyes met, hers full of hate, his calm and almost pitying. She turned away, refusing to look again. The battle was long over, but the scar it left on that neighborhood remained. He had survived not just a pandemic, but the tyranny of a woman who believed power was hers to take. And as he left the store that day, one truth echoed in his mind: in the quiet war of suburbia, justice sometimes wears the face of karma itself. Peace returned, but only on the surface. The quiet that followed Karen's arrest was not the calm of victory, but the uneasy silence before the next storm. Though she was gone, her influence lingered like a stain on the cul-de-sac. The gossiping whispers, the resentful glances, they never fully vanished. Instead, they simmered beneath the neighborhood's polished smiles, waiting for another spark to ignite them. The man had thought the ordeal was behind him. He repaired his back door, reinforced his locks, and upgraded his security system to military precision. Cameras covered every corner of his property now, motion sensors, floodlights, alerts directly to his phone. What once was a home became a fortress. Not out of fear, but out of principle. He had seen what envy could drive people to do. Karen's husband, now her ex, had become a quiet ally. The two men found an odd camaraderie in shared resentment, one betrayed by a wife's madness, the other by a neighborhood's malice. They often talked over beers, sharing stories about how peace could exist even amid chaos. But peace was fragile here. It wasn't long before Karen's shadow reached back from beyond the fence lines. When she went to jail, she left behind a vacuum in the HOA, and like vultures circling a carcass, others rushed to fill the void. The board quickly elected a new president, a man named Leonard Hastings. Leonard was everything Karen wasn't on the surface: polite, composed, professional. But his eyes carried the same hunger for control, the same spark of arrogance that once ruled through her. He approached the man one afternoon, under the guise of neighborly civility. The conversation was short, but the intent was clear. Leonard wanted to restore order to the community, to heal the neighborhood's image after the scandal. And to him, that meant reasserting the HOA's dominance. Karen's fall had embarrassed them. Someone had to pay for it. The outsider was an easy target. Soon after, the letters began again. Petty complaints, trivial citations, notices that made no legal sense, each one stamped with the HOA's seal of authority. The man ignored them, knowing they held no weight. He wasn't a member. But the harassment didn't stop there. Neighbors he had barely spoken to began acting strange. Cars parked deliberately in front of his driveway, trash cans mysteriously overturned, lawn ornaments stolen. Even his mail started arriving opened. It wasn't coincidence, it was a campaign, organized and methodical. Leonard had weaponized the gossiping network Karen once used so effectively. Within months, the outsider was once again the villain. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the row of perfect houses, he stood in his yard and looked at the horizon of conformity, trimmed hedges, manicured grass, white fences all in line like soldiers in a parade. He realized then that this neighborhood wasn't just managed by an HOA. It was owned by fear, a culture built on submission. But he had survived worse. He stood his ground once before, and he wasn't about to bend now. The breaking point came in the middle of summer. The heat was unbearable, and the neighborhood's annual Clean and Green Day, a mandatory volunteer event for HOA members, turned into a weapon. Leonard used it as a stage to publicly humiliate him. In front of dozens of residents, Leonard accused him of neglecting property standards, claiming that his lawn height violated neighborhood aesthetics. The irony was laughable. His yard was cleaner than most. But this wasn't about grass. It was about control. That night he reviewed his camera footage and noticed something chilling. A figure moving near his yard after midnight, flashlight in hand, measuring tape dangling from his wrist. Leonard, the new HOA president, had trespassed onto private property, searching for any excuse to fine or shame him. The footage was crystal clear, Leonard's smug face illuminated by the camera's infrared glow. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an obsession. The man knew that confronting him directly would only feed the fire. Instead, he documented everything: dates, times, footage, and every false letter from the HOA. Slowly, he built a case. It wasn't revenge he sought yet, but preparation. He had learned one thing from the last war: you don't strike first. You strike right. But word of his quiet defiance spread again. The same neighbors who once followed Karen now whispered about him anew. Some claimed he was spying on everyone with his cameras. Others said he was dangerous, unstable, paranoid. The HOA's propaganda machine had restarted. He became the monster they needed to justify their own fear. Late one night, he sat by his window watching sprinklers mist across the dark lawns. A light flickered across the street, Leonard's house. He saw silhouettes inside, shadows moving in heated argument. He didn't need to guess what it was about: power, control. The same poison Karen once drank from. But while the HOA plotted, he planned. He learned their structure, their weak points, their overreach. He knew how they operated, how they depended on the illusion of legal authority. Without that illusion, their empire collapsed. When fall came, the air grew cooler, but tensions burned hotter. Someone spray-painted the word traitor on his mailbox. Another day, his tires were slashed. He never saw who did it, but he didn't need to. The HOA's war had become open now. And just as before, he refused to yield. He filed police reports, quietly collecting evidence, saying nothing publicly. To the neighborhood, it seemed like he was beaten, that he'd finally gone quiet. But in truth, he was watching, waiting. Then one October night, as rain poured across the street and thunder cracked like gunfire, his cameras caught something new. A group of men in raincoats, faces hidden, gathering near his yard. They carried trash bags and something else: stencils and spray cans. They began defacing his property, painting threats across his fence, tearing down his mail slot, scattering garbage across his lawn. He watched it all unfold in real time, phone recording, cameras rolling. This wasn't a random act. This was the HOA's intimidation made physical. Leonard's signature style: silent aggression masked as community concern. The police arrived minutes later, sirens slicing through the storm. The vandals fled, but not before the cameras captured their faces. Neighbors. HOA members. People who had smiled at him just hours earlier. As the flashing lights faded into the wet streets, he knew this wasn't the end. This was escalation. The neighborhood had declared war again, not through words, but through cowardice and fear. But this time, he wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to expose them. Every lie, every abuse of power, every neighbor who hid behind the mask of civility. The man who once stood alone against Karen was about to turn the entire HOA's corruption inside out. Because this time the war wasn't about survival. It was about justice. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered. The smell of wet grass and spray paint clung to the air for days. The fence, once clean and proud, now stood defaced with hate-filled words, a physical reminder of how far the neighborhood had fallen. The man didn't clean it immediately. He left it as it was, a scar meant to be seen. Because scars tell stories, and this one would soon expose the truth. He reviewed every second of footage from that night. The faces of those who called themselves respectable citizens were unmistakable. The HOA vice president, two board members, and Leonard himself, caught in the act of vandalizing property they claimed to protect. It was more than a crime. It was hypocrisy laid bare. He sent copies of the footage to the police, but experience had taught him that justice wasn't swift. The HOA had influence, friends in local offices, connections within city council, people who owed them favors. They had long believed themselves untouchable. But they had never gone up against someone who documented everything. Every visit, every letter, every threat, every moment. He began building a digital dossier, an ironclad record of every violation they had committed since Karen's reign. He spent nights in the glow of his monitors, combing through hours of archived footage, scanning documents, and compiling evidence into folders marked with dates and names. The deeper he dug, the more rot he found. Embezzled HOA dues, faked inspection reports, manipulated property fines. It wasn't just harassment, it was corruption woven into the fabric of the neighborhood's foundation. He learned how they operated like a shadow government. Every month they held board meetings that weren't announced publicly, closed sessions where fines were discussed, where property values were manipulated, where influence was traded like currency. It was an empire built on secrecy. But now, someone was watching. While he worked quietly, the HOA tried to regain control. Leonard issued new letters claiming his property had fallen below standards due to the vandalism. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had defaced his fence and now demanded he fix it at his own expense. He ignored it. The silence enraged them. Weeks passed. Winter came. The neighborhood transformed, snow covering lawns, lights strung across rooftops, a false sense of peace blanketing every house. But beneath that peace, tension pulsed like electricity. The HOA had gone quiet, too quiet. They were planning something, and then one morning it came. A letter marked final notice. Inside, a fabricated document claiming unpaid community maintenance fees, totaling thousands of dollars. It was a lie, and they knew it. But this wasn't about money. It was about power, one last attempt to break him, to drag him into court and bury him in bureaucracy. He smiled as he read it. Because this time they were walking into his trap. That afternoon he visited a lawyer, the same one his uncle had recommended years ago. The man was experienced, calm, and knew exactly what an HOA could and couldn't do. After reviewing the documents, he laughed. "They've overplayed their hand," he said. The HOA had no jurisdiction over his property, no legal basis to demand payment. In fact, their repeated harassment could now be classified as targeted abuse and defamation. The man finally went on offense. His lawyer drafted a formal complaint to the state's HOA regulatory board, attaching the entire archive, the footage, the letters, the vandalism, the trespassing, everything. It was a mountain of evidence so detailed that even the smallest lie unraveled under its weight. Copies were sent to local news outlets. Within days, the whispers began. The first to fall was the treasurer. When confronted by reporters about missing funds, he broke. He blamed Leonard, claiming he was just following orders. Then came the vice president, who resigned suddenly after her face appeared in one of the leaked videos. Leonard tried to fight back, calling it a smear campaign by a disgruntled resident. But the footage didn't lie. The story spread like wildfire. HOA president caught in scandal. Residents question leadership. Community empire crumbles. The neighborhood that once feared its board now turned against it. At HOA meetings, shouting replaced silence. Dissent replaced obedience. The power Karen once wielded like a sword now shattered in Leonard's trembling hands. For the man, it was quiet vindication. He didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. Justice, when earned, doesn't need applause. Still, victory came at a price. Some neighbors avoided him now, ashamed, embarrassed, or afraid of being associated with the truth. Others thanked him quietly in passing when no one else could see. One even left a note at his doorstep. "You freed us, thank you." But freedom always comes with enemies. There were still a few who remained loyal to the idea of control, the remnants of Karen's old guard, and they weren't done yet. One night his cameras caught something unsettling again, a figure standing across the street watching his house. The person wasn't moving, just standing there under a flickering streetlight. When he zoomed in, his blood ran cold. It was Karen. She was back. No longer in prison, no longer behind bars, but standing on the same street where it all began, her face thinner, harder, but her eyes still burning with that same venomous pride. For a long moment they just stared at each other through the lens. Then she turned and walked away. That night he barely slept, not out of fear but because he understood what her return meant. The HOA had fallen apart, its empire exposed, and now she had come back to reclaim it. Neighborhood might have changed leaders, but its disease was the same, and he knew deep down that Karen's story wasn't finished. Her pride had been shattered once, but pride like hers never dies quietly. The man prepared once again. The fortress he had built would stand ready, cameras checked, locks reinforced, his evidence secured, because the next battle would not be about paperwork or politics. It would be personal, and this time there would be no mercy. Winter's frost still clung to the rooftops when she returned. The world had changed since her downfall, but Karen had not. To her, the months in jail were not punishment, they were exile. And exile breeds vengeance. She came back not as a humbled woman, but as a queen stripped of her crown, desperate to reclaim the throne she believed was rightfully hers. The neighborhood barely recognized her at first. Her once perfect hair was now a harsh shade of brittle blonde, her face lined deeper with age and bitterness. But the moment she spoke, the voice was unmistakable, sharp, commanding, dripping with the same poison that had once controlled every household in the cul-de-sac. She didn't ask for attention. She demanded it, and people listened not out of respect but out of habit. Fear, after all, doesn't die easily. She began quietly, knocking on doors like a missionary spreading salvation. She spoke of restoring integrity, of bringing back order, of reclaiming our community's dignity after Leonard's corruption. The irony was almost poetic, the tyrant returning as the savior. And one by one, the weak-minded and nostalgic fell under her spell again. Some pitied her, believing she'd served her time. Others wanted the stability she once offered, no matter how toxic it had been. By spring, whispers became meetings, and meetings became plans. The HOA, now fractured and leaderless, was ripe for takeover. Karen seized the opportunity with surgical precision. The man watched from a distance. He knew this neighborhood too well now, its patterns, its cycles, its weaknesses. Karen's return was no coincidence. She had waited, biding her time until the scandal faded just enough for her to slither back. And while most saw her as a relic, he saw something far more dangerous, a wounded animal, desperate and unpredictable. Her first move was symbolic. She organized a neighborhood renewal day, a thinly disguised rally to announce her bid to reform the HOA. It was held at the community park, the same place where she used to host her rigidly controlled summer gatherings years before. Folding tables lined with cookies and pamphlets filled the air with false warmth. She stood before a crowd of 40 residents, her voice trembling with theatrical sincerity. She spoke of forgiveness, of mistakes learned, of redemption. But beneath every soft word was a blade. She blamed Leonard for everything, the corruption, the vandalism, the chaos. She painted herself as a victim of his betrayal and of a certain troublemaking outsider who had twisted the truth for personal gain. She never said his name, but everyone knew. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others avoided eye contact altogether. When she finished, applause erupted. Controlled, nervous, but applause nonetheless. The queen had returned to her court. From his front porch, the man could almost hear the sound of the neighborhood's soul slipping back into submission. It was happening again. The gossip resumed, the tension returned, and the eyes of the residents found him once more suspicious, wary, judgmental. The narrative was changing, and Karen was writing it line by line. But this time, he wasn't alone. Leonard, disgraced and stripped of his title, had vanished for months after the scandal. Yet when the man least expected it, Leonard reappeared not as an enemy but as an unexpected ally. Broken by guilt, he reached out quietly, asking to meet. Over black coffee and cautious silence, Leonard confessed that Karen had been contacting former board members, gathering old documents and rewriting records to erase her past crimes. She wanted to retake the presidency, legally, this time. She was weaponizing redemption. Leonard handed over what evidence he still had: meeting minutes, personal notes, internal HOA files that showed how Karen manipulated the system even before her first downfall. She had hidden fines, faked votes, and coerced residents into compliance. It was a dark web of deceit that stretched back years. The man realized that the battle had only paused. Now it was about to evolve. Karen, meanwhile, grew bolder. Her influence spread like mold, subtle but suffocating. Those who opposed her found anonymous letters on their porches. Their garbage accidentally spilled across their lawns. HOA fines began reappearing under new names and with new signatures. The tactics were the same, only the mask had changed. And then came the breaking point. One morning the man woke to find an envelope taped to his door. Inside was a letter from the newly reformed HOA, stamped and signed by its new acting president, Karen Miller. She had done it. She was back in power. The letter was short and cruelly familiar: notice of violation. It claimed his property was in breach of the neighborhood's visual harmony standards due to unauthorized modifications, a reference to his upgraded cameras and security lights. The same tools that had once caught her red-handed. It wasn't coincidence. It was personal. He crumpled the paper, but not in anger, in understanding. Karen wasn't just trying to control him again, she wanted revenge. And she would burn the entire neighborhood down if it meant watching him suffer. The harassment escalated rapidly. Anonymous complaints filed to city code enforcement. Flyers posted labeling him a danger to the community. HOA members walking past his house with clipboards, pretending to inspect. His mail tampered with again. It was Karen's old empire reborn, stronger, meaner, and backed by desperation. But what Karen didn't realize was that her every move was already being recorded: every visit, every letter, every shadow on his property. She was building the same noose she once hung herself with. The man knew it was only a matter of time before she went too far again. Because Karen's greatest flaw wasn't her cruelty, it was her arrogance. She believed herself invincible, and like before, that belief would destroy her. Days turned into weeks. The tension in the air became palpable. Neighbors avoided eye contact when he passed. The sound of whispers carried through the night. His cameras caught glimpses of her standing at the edge of his driveway, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes like a hunter marking prey. Sometimes she would stare straight into the lens, her expression cold and deliberate, as if daring him to act. But he waited, patiently, quietly. Because justice isn't about striking first, it's about letting the guilty reveal themselves. And deep down, he knew she would. Because Karen always did. Spring brought green lawns, chirping birds, and the illusion of normalcy. But beneath that peaceful surface, the neighborhood pulsed with unease. The HOA had been reborn under Karen's iron hand, and once again, fear ruled every street. Her presence was everywhere: in the letters slipped under doors, in the sudden inspections, in the whispers exchanged over backyard fences. The residents had forgotten what freedom felt like. They fell back into obedience, the kind born from exhaustion. For years they had lived under her thumb. The brief months without her had felt like chaos. To them, her tyranny was stability: familiar, predictable, safe. And Karen knew that. She thrived on it. But what she didn't know was that her empire was already rotting from within. The man had spent months watching, recording, and gathering. Every move she made was captured, archived, and cross-referenced with legal documentation. Every false claim, every violation of property law, every word of harassment, all cataloged with precision. His home had become a surveillance hub, a fortress of evidence. Karen, blinded by pride, didn't suspect a thing. She believed the neighborhood was hers again. Her clipboard became her weapon, her clipboard her crown. Each new violation she mailed to his house felt like another victory. She didn't realize she was handing him ammunition, proof of her obsessive vendetta. Her tactics grew bolder, her sanity thinner. One afternoon, she staged a neighborhood safety audit, a fabricated event designed to invade his property. When he refused entry, she called city inspectors, lying that his security system violated privacy laws. They arrived, found nothing illegal, and left. But Karen didn't care about results. She cared about making noise, about reminding him she was still watching. Soon, she began targeting others too. Anyone who questioned her authority received warnings, fines, or threats of legal action. One elderly couple, tired of her harassment, put their house up for sale. A family down the street received fines for having unapproved holiday decorations. A single mother was accused of cluttered landscaping. It was madness disguised as order. The man knew her breaking point was near. People like Karen could only maintain control when unchallenged. The moment resistance reappeared, cracks began to show. The final push came from within her own ranks. Leonard, once her enemy, now quietly cooperating with the man, managed to regain access to old HOA records that Karen had tried to erase. Hidden in those files were digital signatures, falsified votes, and documents proving she had reinstated herself illegally. Every action she took as president was fraudulent. Every fine, every citation, every meeting void. The man took it all, compiled it, and built a report so detailed it could bury an entire organization. But instead of going to the authorities first, he went public. One morning, flyers appeared on every doorstep in the neighborhood. Plain white sheets printed with one headline, "The truth about your HOA." Beneath it, screenshots, legal references, and photos. Every resident now held the evidence in their hands. There was no denying it. The HOA they had feared was a fraud. Their president was a criminal again. By midday, the neighborhood was in chaos. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, reading aloud, whispering in disbelief. Karen stormed through the streets like a general facing mutiny, shouting that it was all lies, that it was a smear campaign by the outsider. But this time her words carried no weight. Her subjects had seen the truth. The fear that had held them in chains was breaking. The man stayed inside, watching from his window. He didn't need to speak. The neighborhood was speaking for him now. Dozens of calls flooded the local housing authority. Others reached out to the news station that had once covered the previous scandal. By evening, reporters were on site again, cameras rolling, microphones thrust toward residents desperate to tell their stories. Karen's empire was collapsing in real time. Still, she refused to surrender. That night, under the cover of darkness, she returned to the one place she swore she'd never go again, his house. Her shadow appeared on his cameras at 2:17 a.m., creeping across his driveway, clutching a folder of papers. She was muttering to herself, her face pale and frantic. She shoved the papers under his door, a desperate letter accusing him of ruining her life and promising this isn't over. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The cameras captured everything. The trespassing, the threats, the madness in her eyes. The next morning, the police arrived at her doorstep. Not just for trespassing, but for fraud, harassment, and obstruction of investigation. Her neighbors watched as she was led away again, the same scene, the same street, the same humiliation. The cycle had completed itself. But this time there was no sympathy, no excuses, no applause when she left, just silence. Her house went dark for good. For sale signs followed soon after. Her name disappeared from HOA records, scrubbed clean as if she never existed. The residents elected a new board, this time choosing transparency over control. They voted to dissolve several of the HOA's most restrictive policies. For the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed. The man stood on his porch one evening, the sun setting behind the rooftops, painting the sky in orange and gold. For the first time it was truly quiet. Not the uneasy silence of fear, but the peaceful calm of closure. He had won not by rage, not by revenge, but by truth. The same truth Karen had feared most. Weeks later, he received a letter from her ex-husband, short, sincere, and final. "She's moved out of state," it said. "Working somewhere small, trying to start over. The kids are doing fine, thank you for everything." He folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and closed it. Some wars end with explosions, others end with exhaustion. But this war, the war for one man's home, peace, and dignity, ended with silence. The kind of silence that only justice can bring. Months passed. Seasons changed. The neighborhood, once divided by fear, began to heal in silence. Fences were repainted, driveways repaired, lawns overgrown with a touch of freedom. There were no more letters taped to doors, no more threats disguised as community reminders. For the first time in years, people waved to one another without suspicion. Kids played in the streets again. The cul-de-sac that had once been a battleground became just a neighborhood, ordinary, peaceful, alive. The man rarely spoke of what had happened. When people asked how he'd done it, how he'd brought down the woman who'd ruled with intimidation and deceit, he only smiled and said, by letting her destroy herself, because that was the truth. Karen had been her own undoing, her pride, her obsession, her hunger for control. All he'd done was hold up a mirror and let her see the monster she'd become. But even victories leave scars. Some nights he'd still wake up to the sound of rustling outside, a reflex from years of surveillance. He'd check the cameras, only to find wind, shadows, nothing more. The paranoia had taken root so deep that it lingered even after the war was won. Freedom, he learned, has its own kind of silence, heavy, almost unfamiliar. Leonard stopped by one afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and a folded HOA newsletter. "Can you believe it?" he said, laughing softly. "They're planting trees where the old sign used to be." The man smiled faintly. "Good, something real for once." They sat on the porch together, sipping coffee as the neighborhood carried on, a dog barking, a lawnmower humming in the distance, sunlight spilling across the street where chaos once reigned. For a long time they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Both men knew what it had cost to restore peace and what it meant to keep it. Karen's house eventually sold. A young couple moved in, quiet, friendly, unaware of the ghosts that lingered in their new home's walls. Sometimes the man saw them from his window, fixing up the porch or tending to the small garden. Life had returned to the place where madness once lived. He didn't tell them the story. He didn't need to. Some stories are meant to rest. But one evening, as he walked his fence line, the same fence that had once sparked a war, he paused. The wood had aged, sun-bleached and rough under his hand. He remembered every moment of that fight, every threat, every sleepless night, every test of will. It had all started here. He smiled to himself, shaking his head, all that, over a fence. And yet it had never really been about the fence. It was about control, boundaries, freedom, the right to live undisturbed on one's own land. He realized then that he hadn't just fought for himself. He fought for everyone who'd ever been bullied into silence by rules, by fear, by people like Karen. That was the true legacy. Before heading back inside, he placed a small wooden sign on the fence, carved by hand, simple but strong. It read, "Respect boundaries." No warnings, no anger, just truth. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the street in gold. The last of the light touched the rooftops, the mailboxes, the freshly planted trees swaying in the evening wind. It was peaceful again, fragile but real. The war was over, and for the first time in years, the man finally felt what he'd been fighting for all along. Not victory, not revenge, but peace.